What would you do if you were down to your last $3 in your pocket, and the only thing standing between you and the open road was a scrap of paper nobody else in the county wanted to touch? Frank Walker, 31 years old, hollow-eyed and long past pride, laid those 3 silver coins on a courthouse table in Cinder Hollow and walked away as the legal owner of an abandoned mine most folks swore was cursed. The crowd laughed. The auctioneer shook his head. But what waited behind a sealed wall inside that mountain would rewrite the history of the whole county before the season turned. Settle in, stay close, and let us know from where you're listening tonight, because this is a story worth hearing slow. The wagon that carried Frank into Cinder Hollow was not his own. He rode in the back of a freighter's flatbed, sitting on a coil of hemp rope, watching the ruts of the road unravel behind him like a life he had already stopped mourning. Dust caked the corners of his mouth. His duster, once dark brown, had gone the color of old bark, and the sole of his left boot was held to the upper with a strip of rawhide he had cut off his own belt 3 towns back. He carried a bedroll, a tin cup, a folding knife with a chipped handle, and a small canvas sack that held everything else he still owned in the world. The freighter let him off at the crossroads, where the pine ridge dropped down to the valley floor. Cinder Hollow lay ahead in the low sun, a scatter of gray plank buildings pressed against the base of a black mountain that looked, from a distance, as though it had once burned from the inside out. A church without a bell, a livery with half its roof caved, a saloon whose sign had faded to 2 vowels and a smear of red. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys, and no more. Frank stepped down, thanked the driver with a nod, and stood a long moment in the road, while the wagon rolled on without him. He had been to this town once before, as a boy, with his father, when his father was still a man who spoke. That was more than 20 years ago. His father was in the ground now, and so was his mother, and so was the small piece of ranch land they had scratched out together, up in the high pastures, foreclosed and sold at a price that had not covered the debt. Frank had walked away from that auction 2 months back, with $3 and a receipt for the sale of his own history. He had come to Cinder Hollow because a man in a boarding house near Red Fork had told him the county was auctioning off tax-forfeited land at prices no honest man would refuse. Frank was not sure he was still an honest man. He was sure only that he was tired, and that $3 was not enough to keep him fed past the end of the week. He shouldered his sack and began to walk into town, and the wind that came down off the Black Mountain smelled of iron and old rain. By the time he reached the courthouse steps, the sun had slid behind the ridge, and the street lay in that blue hour, when lanterns have not yet been lit, and the day refuses to end. A hand-painted board, nailed to the doorframe, announced the auction for the following morning, at 10. Frank read it twice, folded the paper of it into his memory, and went to sleep behind the livery on a pile of clean straw a stable boy had pointed him toward, without a word. The morning came cold. Frank walked into the courthouse with his hat in his hand, and every man in the room turned to look at the stranger in the ruined coat. There were 8 lots up for sale. 7 were parcels of grazing land, small orchards, a foreclosed smithy. Frank had no business bidding on any of them. The 8th was a mine, called the Black Step on the ledger, sealed for 19 years, half collapsed at the mouth, marked in the county register with the single word, unproductive. The starting bid was $3, and no one raised a hand. The auctioneer called the number twice. On the 3rd call, Frank set his 3 silver coins on the table, with a click that carried to the back of the room. A ripple of laughter passed through the men gathered against the wall. A tall rancher in a brushed black coat, the one they called Merritt Doyle, leaned to his neighbor and said something that made the neighbor grin and shake his head. The auctioneer paused. looked at Frank a long second, and struck the gavel. Sold. To the man in the brown coat. May God help him. Frank signed the paper with a hand that did not shake. He walked out of the courthouse, the owner of a black hole in a black mountain, and nothing else besides. Behind him, Merritt Doyle called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Boy, you just bought yourself a grave with a door on it." The laughter that followed him down the boardwalk was not cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was certain. Frank did not answer. He tucked the deed inside his coat, next to his ribs, and kept walking toward the edge of town, where the road bent up toward the mine. He did not know yet what he had bought. He did not know that the sealed timbers at the back of the third shaft had been nailed shut, by hands that meant for no one ever to find what lay behind them. He did not know that 19 years was exactly long enough for a town to forget a name it had once whispered. Would you have laid down those 3 coins, knowing every man in the room was laughing? Would you have walked toward that black doorway alone, with nothing but a folding knife and a stubborn heart? And what do you suppose a mountain keeps hidden, when it has kept a secret for 19 years? If a quiet story of a quiet man is the kind of thing that holds you, leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from, and follow along so the next chapter finds you. Because the road up to the Black Step was steeper than Frank remembered, and the door in the mountain was already waiting. Word traveled faster than Frank did. By the time he reached the water trough at the north end of the boardwalk, the story had already gone ahead of him into the saloon, and out the back door, and around to the smithy and the mercantile, and men who had never seen his face were leaning in doorways to see him pass. The stable boy who had shown him the clean straw the night before stood in the livery gate with a curry comb halfway to a horse's flank and forgot to finish the stroke. A woman on the mercantile porch, sweeping the same board twice, murmured something to the girl beside her, and the girl looked at Frank and looked away. He kept walking. His boots made the same tired sound they had made for 1,000 miles. He did not lift his eyes to the windows. He did not need to. He could feel the town settling its judgment on him, the way weather settles on a valley, thick and low and hard to move. 2 old miners on the bench outside the assay office watched him come. One of them spat into the dust and said, "Low but not low enough. $3 for a hole full of nothing." The other laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. Frank passed them without turning his head. At the last hitching post before the road bent up, a boy of maybe 9 was working a piece of pine with a dull knife. He looked up at Frank, with the frank curiosity children have, before the world teaches them to hide it. "You the one bought the Black Step, mister?" the boy asked. "I am," Frank said. "My pa says nobody comes back out of there." Frank stopped. He looked down at the boy and at the little curl of pine peeling under the dull blade. "Your pa may be right," he said. "But I paid for the door. Might as well see what's behind it." The boy nodded, as if this were the most reasonable answer he had ever heard, and went back to his whittling. Frank walked on. He was almost past the last building when a voice behind him said his name, and it was a voice he did not know. He turned. On the porch of a small clapboard house, set back from the road, stood an old man in a black wool coat, too heavy for the season. His hair was white and thin, combed with water. His hands were folded on the head of a hickory cane. He was thin, tired, and forgotten, the way certain elders become when a town outlives its use for them. Frank waited. "Walker," the old man said again, testing the shape of it. "Your father was Reuben Walker." "He was," Frank said. The old man's mouth moved once before words came. "Then hear me a moment, son. What was sealed in that mountain was sealed by men who are still eating supper in this town. Mind the third shaft. Mind whose name is on the timbers. And do not open a thing you cannot answer for." Frank stood very still. "Who are you?" he asked. "A man who remembers," the old man said. "That is all now." And he turned, slowly, and went back through his own door and closed it behind him, and the latch fell, with a small dry click that Frank would hear again in dreams he did not yet know he would have. He was still standing there when a boot heel struck the boardwalk behind him. Merritt Doyle had followed him out of the courthouse crowd with two of his hands at his shoulder. Doyle was tall and clean-shaven and wore a coat that had been brushed that morning. He smiled the way a man smiles at a dog that has walked into the wrong yard. "Walker, is it?" Doyle said. "I own the range that runs up to that mountain on 3 sides. I have owned it for 11 years. I offered the county $200 for that mine 6 seasons back, and they told me it was not for sale. Now it goes for $3 to a man with a rope for a belt." He let the smile sit. "You will be gone inside a week. When you are, I will buy that paper off the county for the price of a bottle, and I will forget your name by the first snow." He tipped his hat, mockingly courteous. "May God help you, boy. I heard the auctioneer say it. I would not want to leave it out." Frank looked at him a long moment. He did not answer. He turned and started up the road toward the mountain, and behind him Doyle laughed once, short and hard, and the two hands laughed with him, and then the boardwalk was quiet again, except for the wind. The road up to the Blackstep was steeper than Frank remembered from a boyhood he could barely reach. It climbed through scrub oak and pine, then out of the trees onto a bare shoulder of black rock, where the wind came without warning off the ridge. The sky went from bright to gray to the color of an old kettle as he walked, and by the time he could see the mine mouth, he could also feel the first cold spit of rain on the back of his neck. The mine sat in a scoop of the mountain's face, like a wound that had never fully closed. Timbers black with age framed the opening. Beams sagged. Rusted iron rails ran out of the dark and stopped in a spill of loose shale a dozen paces from the entrance, as if the ore carts had simply been abandoned mid-shove. A tin sign on a post read, "Blackstep," in letters someone had painted over and then let fade again. Below the sign, weeds grew through a broken wheelbarrow. Frank stopped at the edge of the shale and looked at what he owned. For a long time he did not move. The rain came harder, then let up, then came again. Somewhere below in the valley, a rooster crowed too late in the afternoon, and the sound reached him thin and strange. He had, in that moment, exactly what the town believed he had: a collapsed mouth, a rusted rail, a rotting sign, a grave with a door on it. He felt the laughter of the courthouse settle over him again, and he let it. Then he walked forward, past the rail, past the wheelbarrow, and stood at the threshold of the dark. The air that came out of the mine was colder than the air outside. It smelled of wet stone and old iron and something he could not name, something faintly sweet, like paper that had been closed up too long. He did not go in, not yet. He stepped back to a flat place, under an overhang of rock a few yards from the mouth, and there he laid out his bedroll on the driest patch of ground he could find. He built no fire. He had nothing to cook. He ate the last hard heel of bread from his sack and drank rainwater from his tin cup, where it pooled in a hollow of the stone. Then he sat with his back to the mountain and watched the light go out of the valley below him, watched the 3 chimneys of Cinder Hollow send up their thin gray threads, and listened. The mine breathed. That was the only word for it. A slow, cold draw of air in, and a slower, colder exhale, as if something asleep behind the timbers were dreaming, in a rhythm older than the town. Frank lay down at last, with his coat pulled to his chin, and the deed folded inside it against his ribs, and he closed his eyes, and the mountain kept breathing beside him all night long. He woke before dawn to a sound that did not belong to the mountain. It was faint, a small dry tick that came at uneven intervals from somewhere inside the timbers, not the steady drip of water, and not the settling creak of old wood. Frank lay still under his coat and counted the spaces between. 3 breaths, 5, 2, no rhythm a man could name. He told himself it was a beetle in the beam, or a pebble working loose in a seam, or the wind finding a gap he could not see. But he had slept beside enough old barns and enough dying campfires to know the sound a place makes when it is only weathering, and this was not that sound. It was a sound with a small, deliberate edge to it, as if the mountain were tapping a knuckle against the inside of its own door. Gray light came slow over the ridge. Frank sat up and looked at the mine mouth. In the softer light, he could see what the rain had washed clean the night before. And he saw a thing he had not seen at dusk. On the leftmost timber that framed the opening, at about the height of a man's shoulder, someone had carved a shape into the wood. It was not deep. Weather had softened its edges. But it was there, and once he had seen it, he could not unsee it. 2 letters, cut close together, the second overlapping the first, an R and a W. His father's initials, Reuben Walker. Frank stood slowly. He walked to the timber and laid the flat of his hand against the letters. The wood was cold. He traced the R with a thumb that had known the same letter on the flyleaf of the family Bible, on the strap of a saddle sold at auction, on the inside curve of a tin cup his mother had drunk from until the day she stopped drinking anything. The carving was old, 20 years at least. It could have been cut by any man with any 2 initials. It could have been a coincidence of the alphabet. He told himself both things and believed neither. He did not go into the mine. He turned instead and walked a slow circle around the mouth, studying the ground, the shale, the rusted rail. Under the wheelbarrow, half buried in weeds, he found a length of chain with a broken link, and on the broken link, faintly, the same 2 letters stamped into the iron. He set the chain down where he had found it. He returned to the timber. He looked at the letters again. He said nothing aloud. He climbed back to his bedroll and sat with his knees drawn up and watched the mine mouth as the light came up and the letters faded again into the grain of the wood. And he did not act, not yet, because a man who acts on the first thing he sees on a strange mountain is a man who does not come down. By mid-morning, Frank had made up his mind, not about the letters, but about the day. The mouth of the mine was half fallen in, and would have to be cleared before a man could stand upright in it, and clearing was work he understood. He walked down the shale slope to the broken wheelbarrow and righted it. 1 wheel was gone, but the tray held. He dragged it to the mouth and began, stone by stone, to move the fallen rock out of the entrance. He worked without hurry. He lifted what he could lift and rolled what he could not, and when a stone was too large for either, he found a length of pine from the collapsed timber pile and levered it aside. Sweat cut clean lines through the dust on his face. His hands, which had known rope and rain and shovel and post-hole digger for 20 years, learned the particular weight and edge of this mountain stone within the hour. He took his folding knife from his pocket and used the chipped handle to pry a wedged rock free, and the knife, which had been his father's before it was his, fit the crack as if it had been made for it. He noticed things as he worked. He noticed that the fallen rock at the mouth had not fallen at all, or not the way rock falls on its own. The stones had been stacked. Under the disorder of moss and weather, there was a pattern. The flat faces set inward, the round faces set out. A man had done this, more than one man, likely, and in a hurry, but with the habit of miners, who knew how to make a wall look like a collapse. Frank set that thought beside the initials on the timber and did not speak it. By noon he had cleared enough of the mouth to see 6 paces into the shaft. The rails ran in straight and true, and disappeared into dark. The timbers inside were sound. Whoever had sealed this mine had not sealed it, because it was failing. He drank rainwater from a cupped stone and went back to work. In the afternoon, a dog came up the road. It was old, low-shouldered, its coat the color of dry grass, one ear torn and healed crooked. It stopped at the edge of the shale and watched him. Frank straightened and looked back. Neither of them moved for a long minute. Then the dog came forward at a slow walk and sat down 5 paces from him and watched him work, and Frank went back to lifting stone, as if the dog had always been there. When he stopped for water, the dog drank from a pool beside him. When he moved to a new section of the wall, the dog moved with him and lay down again at the same 5 paces. It had no collar. Its ribs showed. Frank tore the last dry crust from the bottom of his sack and set it on a flat stone, and the dog ate it in 2 bites and lay down again. Toward evening Frank found, under a slab he had rolled aside, a rust-eaten lantern. The glass was gone, but the tin body held, and the wick chamber still had a black stub of cotton inside. He turned it in his hands. On the base, scratched with the point of a nail, were the same 2 letters, R.W. He set the lantern on top of the wheelbarrow where he could see it. He looked at the dog, and the dog looked back with the flat, patient eyes of an animal that had walked a long way to find a man who would not send it off. Frank said, quietly, the first word he had spoken since morning. "Stay." The dog stayed. He worked until the light bled out of the ridge, and his shoulders had gone past aching into a numb, steady burn. He had not gone into the mine. He had cleared the mouth, and he had gathered, without meaning to, 3 things that belonged together: a carved timber, a stamped chain, a scratched lantern. 3 initials, all his father's. On a mountain, his father had never, in 20 years of a boy's memory, once spoken of. He slept beside the dog and woke before the light. The mountain was still ticking, the same dry, uneven sound as the morning before, and now he understood it was only settling stone, cold at night, warming at dawn, but he listened to it anyway, as if it were speaking. He ate nothing. He drank rainwater. He took the rust-eaten lantern from the wheelbarrow, cut a strip from the tail of his shirt for a fresh wick, and poured into the chamber the last of the axle grease he had scraped the night before from the wheel of the broken barrow. It would burn foul, and it would burn short, but it would burn. He struck a match from the tin in his coat pocket. The wick caught. Yellow light shivered on the black timbers. He looked once at the dog. The dog rose without sound and followed him in. The shaft went straight for 20 paces, and then bent left. The air cooled as he walked. The rails under his boots were rust-scaled but true. At the bend he passed a side drift caved in with clean stone, then a second, then a third, and at the third he stopped, because the stone here, like the mouth, had been stacked, flat faces inward, round faces out, a wall made to look like a fall. He set the lantern on a tie and studied it. He judged 4 men, one long afternoon, 20 years gone. He picked up a fist-sized stone from the floor and struck the wall once. It rang hollow. He struck it again. The dog sat down behind him and waited. He worked the top stones loose first, one by one, easing them down to the rail, and for an hour there was no sound in the mountain but stone meeting stone, and his own slow breathing. When the gap at the top was the width of his shoulder, he lifted the lantern through and looked. The light went in and did not come back for a long moment, and then it found, one piece at a time, what was inside. A short timbered chamber, no more than 8 paces deep, A wooden crate against the far wall. A canvas tarp collapsed over a shape on the floor. A tin strongbox, painted green once, now the color of moss. And, nailed to the crossbeam above the crate, a folded oilcloth packet the size of a man's hand. He climbed through. The dog stayed on the rail. He took the oilcloth packet down first, because it was highest, and because his hands, without asking his mind, knew to begin with paper. Inside were 3 sheets folded twice. A bill of sale for a claim called the Blackstep, dated the spring his father had brought him through Cinder Hollow as a boy. A partnership agreement signed by Reuben Walker and 3 other names. And a letter in his father's hand, dated a week before the mine was sealed, addressed to no one, that began, "If any man reads this who is not one of the 4, know that we struck the vein on the 14th of June, and that the men who signed below have chosen to take it from me by force." He read the 4 names on the partnership. One of them was Doyle, not Merritt, his father, Ephraim Doyle. He read it twice. He folded the letter back into the oilcloth. He opened the tin strongbox. Inside were canvas sacks, 7 of them, heavy, the mouths tied with wire, and when he loosened the wire of the nearest and poured a little into his palm, the lantern light ran gold along the grain. Not dust, nuggets, small and rough and unmistakable. He tied the sack shut. He did not open the others. He lifted the corner of the canvas tarp on the floor and let it fall again at once, and he took his hat off, because under the canvas was a man's boots, and above the boots, the bones of a man who had been left in this chamber, with his tools still in his belt, and a bullet hole clean through the crown of a hat that had rolled a foot from his skull. He did not lift the tarp again. He sat on his heels in the yellow light and put his forehead against the back of his wrist, and stayed there while the mountain ticked around him. The dog, on the other side of the wall, whined once, low, and then was quiet. He came out of the chamber, carrying only the oilcloth packet and 1 canvas sack. He left the rest as he had found it. He rebuilt the top course of the wall with his own hands, so no wind or animal would enter behind him. At the mine mouth, the light had gone the color of pewter, and the wind had turned, and the smell in it was not rain, it was smoke. He came down the shale slope with the dog at his heel, and saw, at the bend of the road where the scrub oak thickened, an orange stutter of flame low to the ground, and a wagon overturned on its side. A horse lay in the traces with a broken foreleg, screaming the way horses scream, and a woman was pinned under the sideboard, with a child no older than 4, clutched against her chest. The fire had caught in the dry brush, from a lantern thrown clear in the wreck, and was working its way toward the wagon, at the pace of a walking man. Frank did not remember running. He remembered arriving. He put his shoulder under the sideboard and lifted, and the woman dragged herself and the child free, and the child made no sound at all, which he understood later was the worst sound a child can make. He carried the child. She carried herself, limping. Her hand knotted in his coat. He got them past the fire line and up onto the flat rock above the road. He went back for the horse, with his folding knife open in his hand, and did for it what had to be done, and did not look at the dog while he did it. Then he went back a 3rd time for the strongbox under the driver's seat that the woman had cried out for, and he brought it up to her, and only then, sitting on the rock with the child in her lap, and the smoke rising behind them, did she look at his face in the failing light, and say her husband's name, and the name was one of the 4 on the partnership his father had signed 20 years ago in the mountain above them. He looked at her a long moment. He looked at the child. He looked down the road toward Cinder Hollow, where the 3 chimneys were sending up their thin gray smoke, as if nothing in the world had changed. Then he stood, and he shouldered the strongbox, and he said quietly, "Come with me. You'll sleep under the overhang tonight. In the morning we go to the sheriff together." She began to cry without sound. The child put one small hand against Frank's chest and left it there. Frank started up the road, and the woman followed, and the dog followed her, and the mountain behind them held its breath. They came down into Cinder Hollow at first light, with the strongbox on Frank's shoulder, the woman walking with her hand in her child's, and the dog trailing behind them like a slow shadow. Smoke still hung in the scrub above the road. The three chimneys of the town were sending up their same thin gray threads, and men on the boardwalk stopped what they were doing and stood still as the four of them passed. The stable boy who had shown Frank clean straw came out from the livery gate and walked beside them a few paces without a word, then fell back. The two old miners on the bench outside the assay office did not laugh this time. One took off his hat. The sheriff was a broad, quiet man named Owen Petrie, and he met them on the courthouse steps because word of the fire had already come down the ridge with a rider before dawn. Frank set the strongbox on the plank porch. He handed the sheriff the oilcloth packet and the single canvas sack from the chamber, and said, "There is more in the mountain, and there is a man." The sheriff opened the oilcloth and read the letter through once, then a second time slower, and his jaw set in a way that men on the boardwalk noticed and repeated later. By mid-morning, a wagon had gone up the road, with the sheriff, 2 deputies, and a county clerk named Harlan Beach. Beach was a spare man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that sat low on his nose, and he came back down at dusk, carrying the ledger book and the partnership agreement wrapped in clean linen. He found Frank at the water trough, where a week earlier the town had watched him walk to be laughed at. Beach spoke quietly. "The signatures match the county register. The claim was your father's. The vein is your father's. The bones belong to a man named Josiah Hart, who was reported gone west 19 years ago, and never was. I will file the papers tonight." He paused. "You have been the owner of a working mine since the moment the gavel fell." He tipped his hat and walked back toward the courthouse. Merritt Doyle came in the second morning. He rode in alone without the 2 hands, and he did not dismount at the hitching post, but at the edge of the boardwalk, and he removed his hat before he spoke. He said, "The name in that letter is my father's name." He said, "I did not know." He said, "I would not have known." Frank looked at him a long moment. Then Frank said, "A man does not answer for his father, only for himself." Doyle nodded once, put his hat back on, and rode out of town at a walk. Riders began arriving from Red Fork by the end of the week. A newspaperman came from the county seat, with a leather satchel and a pencil sharpened on both ends. Ranchers Frank had never met tipped their hats when he passed. The woman and the child were given a room above the mercantile, and the woman sat by the window on the second afternoon and watched Frank cross the street and said her husband's name once, softly, so the child would not hear. The dog lay on the boardwalk below with its crooked ear turned toward the mountain. The old man in the black wool coat came out onto his porch as Frank walked past on the 4th evening. He leaned on his hickory cane and watched Frank a long while. Then he said, "Your father would know his boy." He went back inside and shut the door. By the end of that month, the road to the Black Step had been widened by 4 men working for wages Frank paid out of the first small sack. The false wall was taken down stone by stone, and the bones of Josiah Hart were carried out on a clean board and buried in the churchyard on the edge of nothing, under a marker Frank cut himself from a slab of pine. The other 6 sacks were weighed at the assay office by a man from the county seat, and the number he wrote on the slip made him set down his pencil and rub his eyes before he wrote it again. Frank folded the slip into his coat next to his ribs where the deed had been, and walked out into the last gold hour of the day. He went up the road one more time alone, with the dog at his heel and the rust-eaten lantern unlit in his hand. And he stood at the mine mouth as the sun dropped behind the ridge and turned the black timbers the color of copper. He set his palm against the carved R and W on the left post. The letters were warm from the day. Below in the valley, the 3 chimneys of Cinder Hollow sent up their thin gray smoke, and a bell that had not been there a month ago rang once at the church on the edge of town. The woman had bought it, with the first of what her husband's share came to, and she had asked that it be rung at sundown for the men who had not come home. Frank listened to the bell finish. The dog leaned against his knee. He looked at the mountain, and then at the town, and then at his own hand on the wood, and he said, quietly, "To no one and to everything. A man does not own a mountain. He only keeps what was left for him to keep." He took his hand off the timber. He turned. He walked down the road in the last of the light, with the dog at his heel, and the lantern swinging empty at his side. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, for walking the long road up to the Black Step with a quiet man and a tired dog, and for trusting that what the world throws away is often what the world most needs. If this story moved you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale we tell around this fire. Rest easy tonight. Another story is already waiting in the dark.